Hey everyone, welcome to another video. If you love film or television content, please consider clicking that subscribe button because today I'm going to be talking about the prequel to the Hunger Games franchise, and that is The Hunger Game, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So let's get into it. So if you didn't know, this film follows President Snow before he's the president, before he's this massive villain of the Hunger Games franchise, and kind of goes through what made him become this character. And you meet a bunch of characters along the way, and there are plenty of nods to the original franchise of the Hunger Games and the 4 movies that came before. If you're a massive fan of this series, there's plenty of nice little fan servicey moments in there for you. Now, as for me, I am a pretty big fan of the Hunger Games. I've read all of the books except for this new one, as I really want to see the movie first. And of course, I've seen all of the previous Hunger Games movies multiple times, as I really love this franchise and I absolutely adore the characters and the dystopian world that this is all set in. So naturally, I was quite excited for this movie. However, I was fully expecting this to fall flat on its face like a lot of legacy sequels and prequels do, because that's just the way it goes. It seems like when a movie is trying to revitalize a franchise after a couple of years, it always seems to do that because it always feels kind of grimy and a bit of a cash grab. There were some hopeful signs. It wasn't just a completely made up movie just to sell more tickets. It was based off the latest book from Suzanne Collins in this series. It came out a couple years ago, and from what I've heard, this film is a pretty faithful adaptation. And I think the best decision that they made in terms of creating this film was keeping the same director. You have Francis Lawrence once again helming this film. He has directed all of the movies except for the first Hunger Games, so he really understands this source material. He understands these characters. And I think he was the perfect choice to make this movie, because pretty much from the minute it starts all the way to when this finishes, it feels like another Hunger Games movie. The whole vibe is just there. The dystopian world doesn't feel any different apart from the time period, which is exactly what you want for continuation. Now, going into the characters and the performances here, I think they're all quite excellent. I mean, the Hunger Games has usually had some pretty great performances. Some of the better ones out of all of these teen dystopian future franchises that really took a massive hit on pop culture 10 or so years ago. This was definitely one of the more quality franchises, and it definitely continues here. Tom Blythe as President Snow is absolutely fantastic. I'm sorry I keep calling him President Snow. That's just what I know him as. He's just Snow in this, and he's brilliant. He absolutely understands this character. He is a little bit different to what we're used to because he's not that fully fledged villain in power yet. He's a mentor for the 10th annual Hunger Games, and there's some very personal stakes in this. And what I really liked about this movie is that you get a lot of different perspectives compared to what you used to from this series. We've always seen this world through Katniss's eyes as a tribute and then as a leader of this rebellion. In this film, you get to see the perspective of a mentor, someone who is from the capital, as well as a peacekeeper. So there's a lot of different eyes that you're seeing this movie through. And I really like that, seeing the other side of this world a little bit more and going into depth with it all a little bit more. Now, I know Rachel Zegler is a pretty controversial figure at the moment due to her remarks on this Snow White movie that she's got coming out, but I'm here to talk about the performance, not a person. Her performance in this is quite great. She has done nothing but show that she is a talented actress. She was pretty great in West Side Story, and she's pretty great here. Her character draws a lot of parallels to Katniss, and to see this character come to life is quite interesting. She obviously has her differences from Katniss, but there are also other aspects that really remind you of that character. She has plenty of moments where she's singing and she sounds terrific in those moments. She brings a lot of energy to this film that I really liked, and it shows President Snow another side to this world in District 12. So to see that kind of conflict and that relationship blossom was kind of interesting, I thought. But in terms of performances, the biggest standouts to me were actually the veteran actors that were in this film. Viola Davis is absolutely terrific as this villainous character. I mean, she always gets the assignment, and she definitely does here, absolutely nailing her role as this malicious character, as this sinister game maker. You know how they are in the Hunger Games series. She's another one of those, and she is fantastic in this role. Peter Dinklage was another standout to me. He has a little bit more of a reserved performance compared to Viola Davis, who's really out there, but it works just the same. Peter Dinklage is a master of his craft. We've seen him in stuff like Game of Thrones. He is a fantastic actor, and he brings a lot of that gravitas to this film. You know that there's something going on behind the scenes with him, and you can't quite figure out what it is. And when the film starts giving answers, I thought it was quite satisfying overall. And then we have Jason Schwartzman, who I absolutely adore, of course, because I'm a massive Wes Anderson fan. But honestly, whenever he's doing a project outside of a Wes Anderson movie, he's usually quite forgettable in those movies. However, in this might be my favorite performance from him outside of a Wes Anderson film. He's really great as another one of these commentators. He's related to the one from the Hunger Games, and he really captures that energy that these announcers do. I always thought that he'd be a great casting choice in this role, and he really proved me right. He was fantastic here. The build up to the games is very interesting. There's a lot of similar things that you've seen before in terms of the conflict between the districts and a potential rebellion, and how the capital is trying to restrain the districts and keep them all in order. There's a lot of that going on. I find all of that stuff very interesting. It kind of goes into class dynamics a little bit. It's very sectioned off, and I really, really like the way that it handles it, how the districts all have these different roles, and the capital is completely oblivious to it all. And then we have the games themselves, which were quite interesting, quite entertaining. There are a couple of flaws that I have with the games, but in terms of just giving us some more action-packed Hunger Games scenes, it definitely delivers. My gripe with the games in this, though, is that firstly, the arena is quite bland. It definitely doesn't have a lot of that energy or dynamic nature that the Hunger Games or Catching Fire had. And also, a lot of the beats that play out within this Hunger Games are very similar to the very first Hunger Games. I know that we're trying to draw parallels here, and it kind of sets the building blocks for the future, but as a viewer of this film, it just felt a little bit lazy personally. Now, I don't think that this was just the filmmaker's fault. I think that this might have been a problem with the original novel. I don't know because I haven't read it, but just judging the movie here, I didn't really like the direct parallels to the Hunger Games that happen in the future with Katniss. Even though some of you might really enjoy those parallels, once again, I found it to be a little bit lazy. And it kind of takes away from what made Katniss's Hunger Games so special in the first place. Also, the scenarios that these characters find themselves in within the games, once again, very similar to what we've seen before. You have these evil groups, the Koreas teaming up, and then you have all the outside districts forming these nice little connections. There's vulnerable people in here that you feel sorry for, and there's people by themselves that are just doing their own thing, and there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes and how they're trying to manipulate the games. It's all in here, and once again, it all plays out to be very similar to the very first Hunger Games movie. But during all this, you see a lot of development for Snow, and I really, really enjoyed those moments, especially in the first two acts of this film. You kind of start to see a little bit of the building blocks to how he becomes such an evil character. But then again, I'm also a little bit concerned at this point because he seems far too sympathetic as a character. And in the Hunger Games, he may have one or two redeeming qualities if you're being generous, but this guy is an outright villain. He is an evil presence that causes a lot of harm and is very cruel. So in the beginning of this film, I was kind of having trouble trying to find how this President Snow becomes the President Snow in the Hunger Games as we know him. However, we start getting answers in the third act, and while I found the development of him becoming a villain to be okay in its execution. I still think we could have gone a little bit further to making him a full villain. My interpretation of the film and this character was that Snow was someone that just will do whatever it takes to survive. And he kind of is like that in the future, I get all that. But once again, he's this very cruel presence, and I didn't really feel that yet. I still empathize with him a lot in this film. Another thing that I really need to mention is that this feels like two movies that were just jammed together. There's the first two acts of this movie that feel like one whole film with a full arc, and then we have the third act, or the third chapter of this film, and that feels like an entire arc on its own, separate to what came before. And there has been a lot of criticism about the ending of this film, or the third act being a little bit weaker than the rest of the film. And I have to concur with that because it just feels a little bit disjointed, and I wasn't as engaged as those first two acts. I was really on board with this movie on this first two acts, and the third one hit, and I started seeing a lot more flaws pop up. It also blows the runtime out far too much. This could have been 15-20 minutes shorter. This is about 2.5 hours long to almost 2 hours 40. And I think that's far too long for a Hunger Games movie. It should have been cut down a little bit. I know we're trying to cram a lot in here, but you can still be quite succinct. And I do think that there were a couple of scenes that you could have cut out of this movie to really tighten that runtime. But when we get to the very end of the movie, not going into any details, of course, I do think it does stick the landing overall and gets to where it needs to, and really gives you a lot of connecting points from this to the Hunger Games. And I think the thing that's going to become a lot more significant when I'm rewatching the Hunger Games is that relationship and that dynamic between Snow and Katniss, because you can see how this film really affects that. In terms of Snow being this outright cruel character, I know there is a lot of time between what we get in this movie to the Hunger Games. It's like 65 years or so. So there is a lot of development in between where Snow can become this really malicious presence, especially after the situations that this film puts him in. But once again, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more just to really confirm that he is this character. He is this very cruel person. Then just some miscellaneous things. I think the production value of this is quite strong. The visual effects are a little bit hit or miss. I noticed when it got really big and had these massive shots utilizing visual effects, it looked a little bit distracting, but that was very minor. In terms of the costume design and the production design, very, very strong stuff. Pretty much what you would expect from a Hunger Games film. And even though I've brought up a lot of gripes here, I really came out of this enjoying my time with this. I think it's a worthwhile prequel that definitely had me engaged from start to finish. I thought the performances were great. I think the characters are definitely worthwhile additions. There's nothing in here that seems too forced. It is a really good villain arc in a lot of ways. However, once again, I would have liked it have gone a little bit further. And if we had connected the second act with the third act a little bit better, I pretty much wouldn't have too many gripes to say. Because, as I said, this is a good Hunger Games movie. And if you're a fan of this series, I think this is a very worthwhile watch. You're going to have a good time with this, I think. I think some of the things that I really enjoyed about this movie are very specific sequences that I don't want to spoil because they're some of my favorite parts of the movie. And I want you to discover them for yourself. I think that when it hits a lot of these spoiler scenes that develop this character a lot, I really, really thought that they were powerful within this movie and were very well executed overall. Look, as a film, despite all my gripes, I think that this is a 4 out of 5. I do think that this is a very great prequel and is definitely better than some of the weaker entries in the Hunger Games franchise, but it doesn't hit the highs of its really, really strong entries. Those are my thoughts towards the Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Let me know what you think about the movie in the comments below. I once again really want to hear from you if you're a fan of this series. I'm a massive diehard of this series, so I really want to hear your takes as well, especially if you've read the book. Let me know what you think. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.